Hi, I'm Dax from What's Under the Bed. Let's cut to the chase. Subscribe where the dog gets it. Oh, and also enjoy the interview. Joe Dante is the legendary, iconic, and beloved filmmaker behind such great movies as Piranha, The Howling, and Gremlins. His segment in Twilight Zone, the movie, is celebrated. He directed Explorers, The Burbs, Gremlins 2, Small Soldiers, and so much more. I'm thrilled to have him on the show. Joe, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, Dax.
You grew up in Livingston, New Jersey. Before the influence of movies, was there something that really scared you, like the monster under the bed or a ghost in the attic?
Well, I didn't have a lot of fears of things in my normal life. My fears were basically based on what I saw on TV and in the movies. And when I saw Tarantula, which is a giant spider movie in 1955, there were several stages of it when it became a giant spider, and one of them was it was small enough to fit under your bed. So I was always worried that if I put my feet out on the getting up in the morning, that there would be this hairy spider under my bed. And before that, there was another movie called Them, which was about giant ants, and they made a noise that was not unlike the crickets that were in my backyard. And my backyard just happened to be all torn up with pieces of rubble and stuff because it was being redeveloped, and it was sort of like the desert in the movie. And I kept thinking that, and every time a branch would hit the window in the wind, I would think it's a ant antenna. So yeah, I was, and plus you got to remember, my generation was not just afraid of things in the movies. My generation was afraid of being bombed by the Russians, and we were in atomic fear mode. We were taught in school that we had to did these drills where we hide under our desks, and supposedly that was going to save us from the atom bomb. And everybody knew that was ridiculous, but nonetheless, that was the way that was done. And so, even walking to school every day, there was the thought that, well, any minute the bomb could drop. And when an airplane would fly over, we would all tense up. Even in class, we would tense up, and then we would wait for the whistle of what we thought would be the bomb coming. So it was a very paranoid period for kids.
Were there any stories you remember scaring you as a child, like Billy Goat's Gruff or Hansel and Gretel?
I remember those stories, and I had a Grimm's fairy tale book. There's two versions of Grimm's fairy tales. One's the Grimm version, which has got all the good stuff in it, and then there's the cleaned up versions, which end up being turned into Disney movies. But some of the original, like the girl who trod on a loaf, is she just steps on a loaf because she did something bad, and then she sinks into the ground, and that's it for her. The fairy tales are very dark, and over the years, the attempts to lighten them up have been included things like eliminating the part where Cinderella's sisters cut their heels off to try to fit into the slipper, which I think is a pretty essential part of the story, and I think it's one of the reasons why these stories were retold and retold and retold.
The Colony Theater was your place uh, to go to see the Saturday matinees every week. Weren't you more interested in the cartoons than movies at first?
Well, I wanted to be a cartoonist, and I was a huge Disney fan, particularly a Carl Barks fan, who was the guy who drew the Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck comics, which were much more sophisticated than the cartoons. But I was a huge cartoon fan, and the standard repertoire in 1950s was you'd have a kiddie matinee, and which was a great idea because it got kids into the habit of going to the movies, which is sadly disappeared. But we would get 10 cartoons, two movies, and it was $25, 25 cents to get in, and the first boy in line and girl in line got in for free. So everybody would line up. The show started at 1, they'd line up at 11. you know, and it was a perfect place for parents to drop their kids off for the entire afternoon because that's a 3 or 4 hour show to get all that stuff in, and then they can go off and do the stuff that they want to do without the kids. But I was an addict. I mean, other kids were much less enamored of going to the movies every weekend. than I was. And I was literally, it was my church. I mean, when the lights went down, that I was transported into another world, and that was the world I wanted to be in. So every Saturday I marched up for the 10 cartoons, and I would leave when the feature came, because the feature had grown-ups in it. And I wasn't that interested in grown-ups. And then I stayed one day to watch a picture called It Came from Outer Space in 3D. And I realized that, well, these pictures may have grown-ups in them, but they're pretty interesting. So I became a dyed-in-the-wool movie fan.
Do you still have any of your cartoons and drawings from this time?
I saved some stuff that I had done. I used to do comic books with my own cast of characters, all based on other people's casts of characters. And my grandmother, we used to hold on to all that stuff. And eventually, I sent it all to the Motion Picture Academy, because those are the people who take all the stuff that you don't want, you would ordinarily throw out. And they say, well, no, maybe someday some researcher will want to look at what you did. And, you got to figure out some kind of connection with your work and what you were influenced by. So I have that. And I also had a thing where I had a shoebox that I cut off a screen on, and I took the stories that I was doing originally for comic books, and I would do them on pieces of paper, and I would tape them all together, and I would wind them up, and it would be almost like a film reel. And then I would run them through the shoebox for my little brother. And I had done, I think, maybe 30 of these things, which were all, of course, ripoffs of movies I'd seen, but all of my cast of characters. And those, I think, also reside at the Motion Picture Academy.
What is The Mad Doctor of Transylvania Square?
That was a play that I wrote in 5th grade, I think, or 6th, where the assignment was that, we want you to put on a play. And it was not on a theater, proscenium or anything like that. It was just in the classroom in front of the kids. And it was just I can't remember what the hell it was about, but it was just a bunch of silly stuff that I had put together. And it was I guess, looking back, it's probably my first attempt at dramatizing stuff, and everybody got into the spirit of it, and I guess it probably ran about 20 minutes, and it was, I got a good mark. That was important.
Can you tell me about when you first saw the movies, Them and Tarantula? You mentioned them earlier.
I saw them, I saw them at the kiddie matinees, and Tarantula was a difficult movie because it was only playing on Wednesday and Thursday, and that meant I had to get my father to take me to see it. And my father is a golf pro, and he left home really early, and he came home really late, and he was always tired. And I said, but if you don't take me, I won't be able to see this. And so, being the good father that he was, he lugged me out to the theater, and he sat and watched this giant spider movie, which I was so terrified at that I kept leaving the seat and going into the lobby and pacing around. And I remember the manager pointing me out to somebody else and saying, look at that kid, he can't take it. And leaving my father alone to watch a giant spider movie. So, I mean, when kudos are given to fathers who, indulge their kids to the point where they end up, having a career, mine gets the job.
What was your go-to order at the snack bar?
Well, back in those days, there was no snack bar. There were machines. There was a popcorn machine for 10 cents. And you put the 10 cents in, and the popcorn was in a bubble, and you put the bag in, and the popcorn came out. And then there were vending machines which had candy bars in them, and they were usually about 5 cents. And this was an age, I'm embarrassed to say, that one of the products that they sold was a candy called Babies, which was chocolate candy. I personally didn't like it, so I didn't eat it. But that was the era. This is the 50s. This was a less enlightened period.
You formed opinions about the monster movies you saw and began sending letters to the editor of famous monster magazine. One of those letters was published, and we have a copy here. Dante's Inferno was the
That's
you
it.
did.
I believe 13 when I sent that letter. And the reason I sent the letter was because the Famous Monsters was the go-to magazine for anybody who was interested in that kind of stuff. And everybody wanted to get their name in the magazine. And so I sent letters about my favorite horror movies and the best horror movies and the scariest horror movies. None of them got published. And then I sent one that I said the worst horror movies. And it was a bogus letter because I hadn't even seen some of them, but I had to make 50. So I picked a whole bunch out of a book and said, "Oh, these are bad." And to my surprise, I got in the mail from the editor, Fari Ackerman, who was a philatelist, a big package with tons of stamps on it from other countries, and a copy of the magazine. And I opened it up, and here's this whole article, many pages, based on the list that I had sent. Except, of course, I had written it in my 13-year-old style, and he had rewritten it and used big words like symbiotic that I didn't understand what they meant, but I was happy. I took the credit, and that ended up being my first experience of getting into print.
You said you may have learned more at the Grindhouse than at film school. What is Grindhouse, and do you believe film school is necessary to be a filmmaker?
Well, you may remember that Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez had a movie a couple of years ago, probably 10 years ago or more, called Grindhouse. And the idea was that it was a double feature. And there were trailers done by different directors like Edgar Wright and other people and it was to approximate the experience of going to a grindhouse, which used to be theaters in urban areas that stayed open all night, and played triple bills and double bills, and never closed. And I, of course, went to a lot of those kind of theaters when I was in Philadelphia in school. And the grindhouses would play old movies, prints of movies that you couldn't see on TV, you couldn't see almost anywhere, and in a theatrical setting, which is a big difference between seeing it on television. And so I spent a lot of time in the grindhouses. The problem with grindhouses, and 42nd Street was filled with them. It's now, of course, been Disneyfied, but at the time it was a pretty hairy place to go. And I think they tended to not let you in unless you were 18. But I remember going to places that would have been off limits to anybody before that because they were dangerous. I mean, there were a lot of strange things going on in grindhouses, and there were a lot of people who went there to sleep. There were a lot of drunks. There were a lot of people who basically lived there. It smelled terrible. You never wanted to go down to the basement because that's where the bathrooms were, and no one knew if people really came back from the bathroom or just ended up staying down there. And so, but there was no internet, there was no video, there was no way to see these movies unless you could find them. And I was lucky enough to be in Philadelphia, which was a place that had a lot of movie theaters, and they played a lot of old movies, and I got to see a lot of old movies in theaters, and that was the grindhouse experience, which obviously meant a lot to Quentin and Robert because they made a whole movie about it. The problem was that by the time the movie came out, they neglected to explain to the audience what grindhouse meant. And so the movie was a terrible flop. And they had to take the two movies that they had done, which were done with splices and scratches and scene missing slugs and all this stuff as if you were really watching it in a grindhouse. And they had to cut them into two different movies, and they now are available as Death Proof and Planet Terror. But I don't know what happened to the mock trailers that were in it because they were very funny.
You had success with a film called The Movie Orgy in college, which led to an opportunity editing trailers for Roger Corman. Can you tell me why you were late to your first meeting with Roger Corman?
I was late for my first meeting with Roger was because I came out to California. I had never seen a moviola. I'd never seen anything in 35 millimeter. I had only edited the Movie Orgy, which was in 16, and was literally spliced, pieces of film spliced together, no mixing, no coloring, nothing. And so I was kind of unaware of the way things worked. And so on one of the things you have to do in order to make a trailer is you have to dupe sections of the movie so that you can cut them up and put them into a trailer form. And so I had I had put together some stuff for Roger, and unfortunately, on the way to the screening, which would be the first time I had ever actually met Roger, even though I had been a fan for years, was that one of the reels that I was bringing got away from me, and it ran down Santa Monica Boulevard and went into a manhole, and I had to chase it. And so the guy was nice enough to give it back, but it was a little fubsy by the time it had been in the manhole. Anyway, I got there and at the screening late, and then Roger said, "If I were you, young man, I would try to be on time for these things," which was the first thing he ever sent to me. And I figured, boy, this is it. That's the end of my career. But even though what I showed him was just a jumbled mess, he had obviously seen enough jumbled messes from people like me to know how to fix it. And so I made that trailer for a picture called Caged Heat, which was Jonathan Demme's first directorial movie. And the movie made money, and that accrued to me because they said, well, he made the trailer, so the movie made money, so maybe we should have him do more trailers. And so I figured out eventually how to make trailers, and my friend Alan Arkish came on. We became the trailer department at New World Pictures, and we made trailers for all their movies.
Is there a way to watch a movie orgy?
The movie orgy is a 7-hour compilation of things that was inspired by the reissue of a 1943 Batman serial in the 60s, which audiences were invited to stay for the entire 5-hour show instead of weekly, because these things were always shown at Saturday matinees, and then the next week there would be another episode, and they would cheat. At the end of an episode, you'd see Batman getting run over, and then at the beginning of the next episode, you'd see him rolling out of the way, and they were just horrible cheats. And also, it was an incredibly racist movie because it was anti-Japanese, and but it was hilariously funny, and gave an insight into a lot of us as to the attitudes of our parents that had instilled in them in World War II. And so I said, well, I had a serial called The Phantom Creeps with Bela Lugosi, and I thought, well, we could do a similar thing at Philadelphia College of Art, where I was going to school. And so we put together a showing of this serial, and we interspersed it with a whole bunch of other pieces of film that we had. And it was very popular, and John Davison and I eventually turned it into a show that we would take around to different college campuses, and we would rent a bunch of movies, and we would run the first reel, and then we'd go to a different movie, and then we'd go to some other material we had, and then go to another movie, and we'd tell several different stories over a long period. And it was satirical and funny, and it basically allowed me to work for Roger Corman because I wasn't making any money there. And I was getting money from Schlitz Beer, which had said that, oh, we like this. We'll sell this on college campuses, and we'll sell beer, and we'll give you guys some money. So that was how the movie orgy came about, and it didn't really impact my career, except in the fact that I was able to watch things that worked editorial and things that didn't work editorial, and then I could go back and fix them and run it again and see that it now worked.
What was the technique you used to punch up a boring trailer?
Well, there were a lot of boring trailers because we had a lot of bad movies that Roger was paying for, and many of them were shot in the Philippines, and they were not really very good movies. But you could misrepresent the stories by, for instance, finding a shot of somebody buying a bag of sugar and then having the narrator say that it was heroin. And we had an exploding helicopter that we got out of one movie, and we decided to stick it into all the trailers because it was always, anytime anybody shot a gun, we would cut to the exploding helicopter, and it always worked great. And these movies always played so quickly that people didn't really remember that they had seen these TV spots with exploding helicopters in them, because when they saw the movie, there's no exploding helicopter. So that became kind of a style for us. We were always misrepresenting the bad movies, but there were some good movies, which we also did trailers for. We did trailers for foreign movies by Truffaut and Fellini and stuff, and we learned a lot about editing doing those trailers.
What is the formula to make a Roger Corman film?
Well, you have to make it quickly, cheaply, and you have to be able to make quick decisions. And of course, the content of the movie is based on whatever it is that's selling at that point. He was doing 3 girls movies where teachers and nurses took their clothes off, and then he was doing sort of the Filipino revolution movies, and they always had a political bent. But that was always secondary to the fact that they were action movies, and you had to have a lot of action in the trailer. And Roger, of course, before all this, he had been directed a lot of movies, which I had seen, like the Edgar Allan Poe movies, and yeah, I was a big fan. I thought he was really a good director. And one of the things I can say about my career is that I've worked for a lot of different people, and I've never gotten notes so intelligent as I got from Roger Corman, because he was a filmmaker. And that was also true of Spielberg. When I finally worked for Spielberg, it was like, now I'm working for people who actually know what they're doing. And if I have a question, they'll answer it based on their own experience, as opposed to when you go off and work for the studios, you're working for a bunch of executives who don't really have any idea how movies are made. And they just, they just tell you whatever their wife told them after they saw the movie.
The first solo directorial debut was Piranha, a movie I love. My father and I traveled to San Marcos, Texas to visit the filming locations. Did you have a dangerous encounter scouting locations for this movie?
Well, we shot it in San Marcos, Texas, and that was because there was a drought in California and we couldn't shoot anything here with water. So, and also it was good to get away from California, because the New World pictures were all looking kind of the same, because they had all the same kind of locations. We were a little cavalier in the way that we scouted for locations, and that we were from out of town, and so we went to Texas, and we were driving around on our that looks like a good place to shoot. So we go down, and it's got a riverbank, and go to the riverbank, and then we forget the fact that we just crossed a fence, and there's some farmer who owns this place, and now he's got a gun, and he says, "We are trespassing. We're going to see the sheriff." So we learned quickly about how you have to adapt yourself to the environs that you're working in.
I know you can swim, but I've heard you don't really enjoy water, swimming, being in the water, under the water, or peeling yourself in and out of a wetsuit. Did you ever have second thoughts about making a fish picture?
No, not really. I mean, it was a job. I mean, it was if I hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it. And it was not a very good script when I got it, and when when we brought John Sayles in, he fixed it and it made it better. I was always convinced while I was doing it that it was going to be the worst movie ever made, and I would never work again. But I certainly don't regret making it, and I had a good time within the strictures of making it really quickly and cheaply with special effects that we had no idea how we were going to do them or whatever. And it was a very successful movie, particularly in South America, where they knew what piranhas were. And perhaps to my benefit, it opened during a newspaper strike, so there were hardly any reviews.
The Howling is an amazing film about werewolves and has one of the greatest transformation scenes ever filmed. You may have invented Easter eggs when you name the characters after the directors of different werewolf movies. How many werewolves were built for The Howling?
Well, the funny thing about the werewolves is that there is only one. And we only had it by the end of the movie. When you look at the movie, you'd get the impression, particularly in the scenes where they get attacked in the car, that there's a lot of werewolves. We didn't have a lot of werewolves. We didn't. We had one werewolf and a bunch of hands and a couple of heads, and that was it. And it was all done through editing. There's only one scene in the picture, which was a reshoot, where Belinda Velasquez is taking a file out of a cabinet, and there's a werewolf in the room, and he grabs her. But even then, it was only half of a werewolf, because we didn't have the bottom half. The bottom half was fake legs that we would shoot separately, and it was a low budget movie. And I think we, considering how difficult the time was, Rob Bottin, who had worked with me on Piranha, did an amazing job with not much to work with, I just can't tell you how much I'm impressed with the work that he did.
Can you explain the scene with the headlights?
Well, what happened was we were shooting in the barn at the end of the picture, and the generator went out. Now, in a low budget movie, when a generator goes out, it's going to cost you a lot of money. You got no generator. So I did something that Roger Corman had always told me he had done, and I never believed him, was we shot the scene with car headlights. We brought all the crew members' cars around, and we turned the headlights on and shot the scene with headlights. And it doesn't look quite as good as it would if it was correctly lit, but we got through the night. And that's something I always remember, that Roger was right.
Did Michael Powell's film Peeping Tom have any influence on The Howling?
I love Peeping Tom, but I can't say that it has any influence on The Howling, no.
We interviewed Jeremy Licht recently, and he asked us to say hello.
Jeremy Licht, what is he? Is he like 90 now? How old is he now?
Jeremy played Anthony in your segment of Twilight Zone, the movie. Anthony's world was like a nightmarish cartoon. Who played the sister with no mouth?
That was Bart Simpson's voice.
The other sister, the one with no mouth.
Oh, that was Sherry Curry, who was a rock person at the time.
Bimbo's initiation was the black and white cartoon playing in the background, among others. Was much of the research to match the cartoons from your personal knowledge, or did you have researchers?
We didn't have any researchers. I didn't need researchers. When it comes to cartoons, I have lots of knowledge, and I've seen lots of them. And Richard Matheson, who wrote that episode, we were both trying to figure out a way to try to make something that was as good as the original Twilight Zone episode that we were remaking, which was excellent. So we went back to the original story by Jerome Bixby and decided to change the locale and make it about a kid who turns people into cartoons and puts them into cartoon land. And that was great for me because I already had a terrific knowledge about cartoons, and we were working at Warner Brothers, so we had access to all the Warner Brothers cartoons and the sound effects. And so the difficulty was really with Jerry Goldsmith, the composer, because he had to imitate the cartoon music that was done in the original films, which was done in a very specific style by musicians who were used to doing that kind of music. And his orchestral musicians were not adept at working that fast. And so there was a lot of trial and error trying to imitate that kind of music.
Who is Walter Paisley?
Walter Paisley was a character that Dick Miller played in The Bucket of Blood, pictured by Roger Corman, a beatnik movie, a very clever movie written by Charles Griffith. And we decided to use that name for him in The Howling. And it became kind of a trope, and everybody started hiring Dick and having him play Walter Paisley in a whole bunch of movies after that. None of this had anything to do with the actual character that he played. It was just sort of a nod to the fact that this was probably his most iconic work.
Gremlins was an amazing movie and a great success. You've given many interviews about this movie that people can find online, so I won't get into it here. But wasn't this the movie where you met Chuck Jones?
I had met Chuck Jones at the Telluride Film Festival, where I was, which I used to go to in Colorado. And of course, I was, a big Chuck Jones fan. So that's when I asked him to be in Gremlins. It was after I already knew him.
Yeah. When Ray Bradbury was hired to write a treatment for the meteor, which later came from the outer space, the studio wanted the story one way, and Bradbury wanted the story to go another. He wrote two treatments, one for him and the other the studio. He thought if they didn't pick his story, he would leave the project. They chose his. Can you speak briefly about the studio interference you experienced on Explorers and later on Looney Tunes Back in Action?
Well, the thing about working for studios is that, as I said, when you're working for filmmakers, that's one thing. But when you're working for studios, you're very often working for people who have a temporary job. And their job is not safe unless the movies that they produce make money. And if you happen to come during a downturn, there's even more scrutiny on what it is that you're doing. And when I made Explorers, I was working for some people who were very interested in having me do it, and were very supportive up to a point, and then decided that they were going to leave and go to another company. And then the new people who came in, who didn't have anything riding on this picture because they didn't initiate it, decided they wanted it 2 months early. And basically they said, just stop working on it. We're going to release it the way it is. And I said, well, it's not done. This is not my, yeah. And because Peter Bogdanovich had a lot of problems with Universal about a movie called Mask, and got a black eye in the industry, I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't be fighting with these people publicly about this. I should just try to make this work as best I can. So I essentially acquiesced to releasing an unfinished movie, and I've always regretted it, but that's the way it is. And then, of course, it came out and it didn't make any money, and it had a terrible ad campaign because they didn't care. They had all these movies that they had inherited from the previous administration, and they dumped every single one of them. Every single one of them was a flop because they didn't care, because they didn't want them to make money, because it made them look bad if the previous administration's movie made money. So it was a very depressing lesson to learn.
Many of your films are shot on backlots and sound stages. Do you prefer this over being on location?
No, locations are great. There's certain things you can't do on locations, like in the Burbs. They wanted to blow up a house, and they said, "Well, let's shoot it in Nevada or something." And I said, "No, you can't go into people's neighborhoods and blow up their houses. It's something you have to do on the backlot." The great thing about the backlot is you have total control. You can do car chases, you can do wrecks, you can do whatever you want, and it's all fine. But if you go out into the real world, it's a lot more difficult because you've got a lot more problems with the police, problems with the. It's just so much easier to do it on the backlot. Now, on the other hand, sometimes the backlot isn't the right look for a movie. On Gremlins, we wanted it to look like an old movie, so we were happy to do it on the backlot. And the same thing with the Burbs. It benefits from the fact that it looks like an old movie, and that's because that's part of the way we approached it. But I certainly wouldn't think that you'd want to make Lawrence of Arabia on the backlot.
Is it true microphones were picking up the Jaws ride on one of your movies?
Yeah, I was on the Burbs. There was a writer's strike, and there was almost nobody shooting except us. And we were right up on this new area that they had built, with picking some houses from down the bottom of the lot and put them up on the top of the lot. And it was right near the Jaws ride. And the one thing that Universal prizes above all is the tour, because it makes them more money than any of the individual movies. And so sometimes we would have to stop shooting because you'd hear somebody going, no, and the stuff they were piping in for the Jaws ride, which was it was pretty loud. And I remember the first time I ever took the Universal tour, I was watching them shoot an episode of Sheriff Lobo, and the actors were talking, and the tour guide is saying, "Now they're shooting Sheriff Lobo. There's Claude Akins, and he's." And I thought, they can hear this. I mean, this will be on the soundtrack. And then I realized why all the Universal Pictures TV shows that I watched on TV sounded so hollow is because they were all dubbed afterward, because they just figured it was much more cheap to dub the movies afterward than to try to get people to shut up and record good sound.
In the Institute of Gremlins 2 studies described Gremlins 2 as both a sequel and a mockery of sequels. Quentin Tarantino called it a Mad Magazine parody version of the first film, and said it was the movie you were born to make. I believe you even said it was the sequel to end all sequel. What makes a good sequel?
Well, the trick with a sequel is that you're trying to make something that's better than the first picture, but enough like the first picture that you won't alienate people. And it's always better, I think, to go in a different direction, because the tendency is, let's just make the same movie over with different actors. And that usually doesn't work. I mean, look at movies that have had lots of sequels. I mean, all the Tarzan movies are basically the same, but they give the audience exactly what it is that they came to see, no matter who's playing Tarzan. when you get into the Die Hard movies, you're essentially telling different stories, but it's always really a version of the same story that you saw in the first movie, none of which are as good as the first movie, and that's the problem. You're always being compared to the impact of the first movie, and rarely, as in the case of Bride of Frankenstein and the case of Godfather 2, people will say, well, this sequel is even better than the original movie. But the trick is that there can't be a sequel without the original movie. So the original movie is really still important and still, the go-to place. So for Gremlins, there was really no reason to have a sequel except that the studio wanted to make more money. And I turned it down a number of times until they came back to me and said, we really want a sequel. And then I said, if you let me do whatever I want, then I'll do a sequel. And they said yes, and they were true to their word. And I don't think they were very happy with the result, because it was a movie that was about why there shouldn't be a sequel to Gremlins.
There were a number of movies you were attached to that were never made. You left Jaws 3, People's Heroes, to make The Howling. People wanted you committed for turning down Batman. There was a Godzilla Attacks Hawaii movie with Christopher Lee and Bruce Campbell. Was there a movie you wish you had made that didn't happen?
I tried to get to do Something Wicked This Way Comes, which was based on the Ray Bradbury story. But at the time, I didn't have enough experience, and the Disney people didn't trust me to do it. And then, unfortunately, I saw the movie that they made, which was actually made by a great director, Jack Clayton, who they treated terribly. And the movie isn't really very good. So that was probably a bullet dodged. But the movies that I've wanted to make have mostly not been made if I didn't do them. And the movies that I would most like to make, I had a movie about Chuck Jones at Warner Brothers called Termite Terrace that everybody said I should make. But Warner Brothers didn't want to make a movie set in the 30s. They wanted to make a movie that was set now, and so they made Space Jam. And they were very happy because Space Jam had a lot of money. Then there was a Mummy remake that John Sayles and I had written for Universal. And it was a contemporary version of the Mummy. And it was pretty good. But the Universal people said, no, it should be a period picture like the first Mummy. Well, they didn't realize it's their own movie, but they didn't realize that it wasn't a period picture in 1933. It was a modern picture. Anyway, they went ahead and made their own version of the Mummy, which made them very happy because it made a lot of money. It wasn't anything like what I would have done with it. But it's just it's the break. Sometimes sometimes the pictures get made, sometimes they don't.
First job Chuck Jones had in animation was as a cell washer for the co-creator of Mickey Mouse, who left Disney in 1930 to create a character called Flip the Frog. His job was to wash the original paintings from the cells so they could be reused on the next production.
Just think if he hadn't done that, how much you could sell those cells for.
Just about to say all that artwork was lost forever. It's really depressing. Your trailers from Hell and its podcast Movies That Made Me are a wonderful way to promote movie presentation. How did those projects come about?
Well, Trailers from Hell, I was a trailer collector. I had 35 millimeter trailers, and they were just sitting in my vault, and nobody was watching them. And it's not that easy to run 35. Not many people have 35 millimeter equipment, and you got to go to a theater, and you got to go to a projectionist. And so we would run occasionally at midnights at some theaters. We'd run a bunch of trailers. But I thought, well, I should probably put these up on the internet. This is like, 98, was it? I can't remember. It was a long time ago. So we did that and put them on the and I thought, well, so what? Maybe I should just do some commentaries. So I did some commentaries. And then some friends of mine saw it and said, oh, I have a movie I'd like to talk about. And so it sort of slowly grew into this sort of a behemoth now. There's like almost 2,000 trailers on the site, and there are all these different people, all these friends of mine in different various walks of life in the movie business. The trick was we didn't want any critics or academics. We wanted to get real filmmakers, people who worked in the business, to talk about these things and say, this is a movie that inspired me, or this is a movie I don't like. And then that led to the podcast, which I do with Josh Olson, and where we ask people not to plug their new show, although they often do, but what were the movies that made you want to be a filmmaker? And it's been really quite fascinating. I've gotten to meet a whole lot of people I never probably would have gotten to meet. The advent of COVID has allowed me to actually expand my uh, range of acquaintance, because so we can talk to people overseas. We used to have people come to us in Burbank, and that was a fairly limited. Have somebody who's in town and they have the time to go in, and then the time to get there, and the time to leave. But with the Zoom, all you do is you push the button, and there they are. So it's been really a lot of fun. And I was not a podcast guy. I don't even drive, so I don't listen to podcasts in the car or anything like that. And when Josh approached me, I said, what do I have to do? And he said, well, we'll just fix it so you don't have to do anything. We'll book the people and you just show up. And I said, that sounds good. And he's been true to his word. That's how it works.
Your movies Burying the X and Homecoming involve zombies. Do you prefer fast zombies or slow zombies?
Well, my first experience with zombies was, from movies from the 30s, where they shamble around, and they're essentially the living dead, and they're in White Zombie, which is kind of the go-to movie for setting up the genre. They're exploited workers who are doing, they're soulless and they've been reanimated, and they do menial tasks. Then I Walked with a Zombie, which is made in the 40s, has essentially the same kind of zombies in it, but it's a more artistic movie. But they didn't really call these characters zombies until when Night of the Living Dead came out. They're really ghouls. They're not zombies. But then the zombie appellation suddenly came, and they're like, oh, now it's all zombie. And then the Italians decided to make a whole bunch of these imitations, and now they're all zombies. So there's lots of zombie movies out there. In fact, it's because it used to be a rather despised genre, and now it's like it's a subset of werewolf movies. But as far as zombies go, how I like my zombies, I'm a little closer to the shuffling kind of zombies. I think the fast moving zombies are good and scary, but when I was a kid, we would watch the Mummy movies. People would say, well, but why would the mummy be scary? Because he walks so slow. And I said, yeah, but he always gets his man.
This last question is a Sophie's Choice. Two must die, so when they live. Mad Magazine, Looney Tunes cartoons, or It Came from Outer Space?
Is this an either or? I don't get all three?
You do not get all three. You only get one.
Well, Mad Magazine was awfully influential to me, and it's really kind of defined my entire approach to life. And so as much as I love Looney Tunes, I think I probably have to go with Mad Magazine.
Thank you for sitting down with me. Is there anything you want to ask me before we go?
No, I'm just curious how you got into this.
Me and my dad have always been movie fans, and I started off as a really young child watching horror movies. One of my first movies was The Blob, and honestly, it's always been from there where I've just grown to loving horror, and then I decided to do this.
Do you have any plans? Are you gonna turn this into something else?
I plan on going actually into the movies. I want to be in the business. Yeah.
You want to make movies?
Yeah.
So do you write?
I don't. I write short horror stories.
It always helps to have something to shoot. Actually in front of you, as opposed to making it all up.
Yeah, honestly, I don't want to directly make the movie. I don't know what I want to do, but what I really want to do is something where it's like helping create the movies more than creating them myself.
Well, what you might want to do is you might want to get a hold of a camera and some friends and go out and do something. Do a short. Horror movies are a great entree for learning how to make movies, because you have to use every single cinematic trick in order to make it work. And you don't need a lot of people, and you don't need a lot of places. You need darkness. People are scared of darkness, and they're scared of things that they can't see. And you can really do something pretty effective for not a lot of money. That's my advice.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm starstruck that I just got advice from Joe Dante.
Doesn't mean you have to take it.
Thank you again. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. Is it okay if I stop the recording?
I guess that's the plan, isn't it?
Yeah.